Today is, for better or for worse, June 3rd of 2020. And the United States is burning, largely because of the media's constant stoking of this sort of thing for the last, 30 years. I mean, at least. I remember the Rodney King violence, the edited video, the manipulation of information, the deliberate stoking of anti-white violence. And in fact, that case in 1992 was one of the things that changed my world. For the first time, I saw media actively doing everything in their power to hurt, murder white people. I'm never comfortable with racial categories, never have been. But when they're rammed down your throat every day, sometimes quite literally, you have no other choice. But all of these mawkish and maudlin calls for peace are it's just middle-class hand-wringing. There's no leadership, there's no ideology, there's no beliefs. It's pure abulia, and all they really know how to do is repeat some slogans from the McGovern campaign in '72. But I remember, today, of course, I remember the narrative. It's the same narrative over and over and over again. I guess the jogger in the work boots didn't quite take it. And so they invented this one. This is a very, very strange one. Right away, I noted that, there's in the actual case of this guy, killing this counterfeiter, whatever the heck it was, there's a vanity plate on the police car that says police on it. I don't know if you've ever seen that before. There can only be one of them. It's not a normal police license plate. It's a vanity plate that says police on it. I've never seen that before. It's not a normal municipal plate. That was one thing I noticed. Another thing I noticed is that this is all out in the open. The police is looking right into the camera, knowing full well what's going on. And they know each other. And of course, the script was released, and no one ever bothered to ask these questions. But this isn't really critical thought. It's just thought. Nothing makes any sense here. We know, of course, that rioting has always been the tool of the regime. We've all read the reports of the pallets of bricks that show up in the middle of nowhere where there's no construction. No one can explain why there are these police cruisers full of weapons that are just in the middle of nowhere and get ransacked. And of course, as always, the police were told not to fight back, and so people were killed, and white people are now being targeted for being white. That was never the case for Black America. There was always, these were criminals. Every one of these cause celebs are vile animals, from Rodney King on down. These aren't, this isn't Duke Ellington here that they're talking about. They're the lowest of their community. Rodney King was pulled over because he was beating the crap out of his girlfriend. That was cut out of the narrative. When Stacey Kuhn wrote his tell-all biography, presumed guilty, you would think that mainstream publishers would be screaming for, what would sell. No, it had to be published by Reaganry. No one would touch it. And no one even knows what his point of view is. But I distinctly remember that in 1992, I saw that full unedited video, and no one ever saw it again. Of course, the police were more than justified in what they did. Anyway, when this virus hit, regardless of any questions about its origin or purpose, it was a economic phenomenon. I'm sick and tired of this now. Obviously, the regime suddenly has discovered that protesting is perfectly okay when they're non-white, or at least supporting a non-white cause. But when we were in the street just a few weeks ago, we were irresponsible. We were going to kill thousands of people. The only good thing that's coming out of this, of course, is the radicalization of our people and the complete unbridgeable chasm between the media and ordinary human beings. But all of this comes down to one concept, and that is that this is about economics. Within 48 hours after the announcement of the lockdown, I remember that one of the first news items was a massive bailout of Wall Street companies. If you guys remember, and I have quotes from the Financial Times, from the Guardian, last year talking about how wonderful the economy is, that this is a record expansion. Within a few months, Wall Street was collapsing. This is 48 hours into the lockdown. Well, there was only a handful of people saying that we were in a depression. I was saying this a year ago. I was saying this 2 years ago. I was saying this 5 years ago. I was saying it, a tiny handful of others, Paul Craig Roberts, a handful of others, with any knowledge of economics at all, were saying everything, of course, they're saying now. And very little of the trillions that have been permitted into the economy have actually gotten to ordinary people. Only about 150 billion have gone to states for relief. And as we've said somewhere else, this is earmarked. The states can only spend this money on certain things, non-budget items, which is really what they need. And how hilarious is it to watch Mitch McConnell and these idiotic fiscal conservatives who have no problem with giving trillions to their friends, and they are personal friends, but then get all angry when someone talks about expanding Medicare or being more generous on public works. They get outraged. This is the financial oligarchies I've been saying my entire career, which is now exoteric and out in the public. Just think of it like this. Banks now have minimal reserve requirements. They have minimal capital requirements. Given the nature of interest rates today, banks can now borrow for free. But how much are you paying on your credit card? It is pure profit on something that actually doesn't exist, and that's money. It's something that they, hit return on the keyboard and that's it. And they don't even have to do that. Money exists because people believe it. It does. This is the whole nature of postmodernism. I have several papers on Baudrillard and Foucault. The object in nominalism is the only thing that exists, but postmodernism very quickly removes the object, and now you only have the word. That's all that it is. It's images. It's sounds. Who controls that? It's a tiny handful of people. The last thing I'm going to say about this particular issue, and there's really not much to say, all you have to do is see what's going on, is that everything here we have predicted. Everything here we have been predicting for 20 years or more, precisely in this way. And somebody put on YouTube, I made a prediction in April on this show saying that the regime is going to start using racial issues to get violence out in the street to keep people home. I said this in April. It's on YouTube, my prediction. I said because you have an oligarchy that is now open and declaring itself as such, with Bill Gates making policy somehow, you're going to need things to keep people distracted and off balance. And race, I said something like they're gonna massacre a couple black kids on a playground or something like that, and that's what's gonna cause it. Well, they use it. I predicted this. Most of my predictions come true. This was pretty blatant because it was only a short time ago that I said they're going to use racial violence because the bailout, the economy, is so blatant the massive simply giveaway of trillions of dollars to a handful of Wall Street firms without any restrictions. The handful of dollars that are given to ordinary people have nothing but restrictions, and most of us haven't received it. The states have only received about 5% of what they were given. This is in early May, there was a report from the Institute of Policy Studies. Now, of course, we all know that tens of millions of Americans have lost their jobs. But I think only a few of us know that the wealthy have seen, just in the first 2 weeks of the lockdown, $282 billion added to their fortune in just 23 days. So 3 weeks of the lockdown. We're talking about a soon-to-collapse economy. 40% collapse by the middle of the summer. And yet, this tiny group of liberal elitists are seeing their wealth go through the roof. Something that the fiscal conservative idiots don't acknowledge, because they live in a fantasy world. Between 1980 and 2020, the tax obligations of America's billionaires, if you measure it as a percentage of the wealth that they hold, went down by 80%. So in 30 years, the last 30 years, billionaire wealth has soared by over 1,100%. There is no median household wealth increase at all. I mean, they claim it's 5%, but that's below inflation and way below their debt servicing. So it's a net decrease. Now, when you talk about the American economy, you have to talk about gender. Because over the last 10 years, women have done very, very well. Especially if they have a college education. They out-earn men. They outperform men. Not because they're better, but because they get, especially if they're attractive, they get what they want. We all know this. We've all seen it, whether we want to admit it or not. Women out-earn men, and they are, pretty much guaranteed a good job if they have a college education. Men are suffering. So even if you say that median household income has gone up by 5% over the last 30 years, which is ridiculous, which is nothing, which is a decrease, given debt service and the cost of living and everything else, you have to realize that you have to separate that by gender. Without gender, that doesn't make any sense. You can't talk about economic statistics, really. And we talked about this, as far as the Montenegrin thing is concerned, we talked about what oligarchy does. The minute modernity comes into a society, it introduces money, the standardization, introduces classes. It unleashes passions that normally didn't have an outlet. It creates factions based on something other than, ethical concerns or ideological concerns. It's now purely financial. Debt becomes a weapon. All of a sudden, you have police and prisons. Societies up until modernity never had those things. And as always, modernity in this kind of system has to be imposed by force. We're talking about, it doesn't matter where we're talking about. The nature of oligarchy is such that wherever they go, they're liberal by definition because they need a liberal system to function. In a national system or any other system, they would have no right to have them, but they haven't earned this. But you can't possibly earn billions of dollars. If the guy who cures cancer, of course, he won't be curing cancer by himself, even that doesn't work. It's not possible. Total wealth held by America's billionaires now is $3 trillion. But in 1990, the total wealth held by American billionaires was roughly $240 billion. That's not that long ago. Now remember, these figures are only what they report. This is way low. They don't have to report anything they don't want to. But the super wealthy has gained more wealth in the first 3 weeks of the lockdown than they made total prior to 1980. One of the things that the neocons and the fiscal idiots do is they talk about socialism. They don't know what it is, but they know they don't like it. And they talk about socialism in order to blunt the impact of those figures. Just 3 people. Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Warren Buffett. Those 3 individuals own as much wealth as the bottom half of all American households put together. The fact is so overwhelming that it often doesn't have any real impact. We live in an oligarchy. Now, what's the relevance here? it's relevant what we've been talking about for the last 3 weeks in Montenegro, because the minute this group moves in, you can't have an oligarchy when you don't have a modern system. You can't have an oligarchy without monetization and standardization and globalization, even if it's just, continent-wide. Oligarchy creates ideology. It creates standardization, which means you get prisons and police for the very first time. You have political parties. You have these divisions. You have people who take a political position because it suits their financial interests. And it's hilarious to read people today talking about America. They've just discovered. You have economists who've been working for 40 years, suddenly just discovered that America's an oligarchy. It wasn't that long ago where the word oligarchy was not permitted. And they can't believe that the super rich have captured power everywhere. And guys like Alan McLeod from Center for Research and Globalization talk about this like it's a revelation to them. If you guys remember a few years ago, you kind of wonder these rioters, these movements, where they get their money. Just a few years ago, Buffett and Gates bought up dozens and dozens of charities. No one ever said who it was. They just said charities, and everyone's supposed to be happy about that, giving billions of dollars away. Well, all it really did was shield all that money from taxes, and they bought all these organizations. And the press went wild. I think it was back in 2008 or so. And the media, of course, always doing their bidding, acted like they've suddenly discovered, their compassionate side. But of course, the reality is, because none of these people were paying any taxes, social programs, which were necessary, were crippled. A large drop in living standards, especially for white men, even to the point of dropping in life expectancy and increase in suicide. And you don't see this drop outside a major war or famine. No one really believes that kids are going to be better than they. And of course, they're right. And statistics, they're only as good as the press who bothers to report them. And of course, the press doesn't report these things. They interpret these things for you. See, here's what happens. And I'm seeing this all over the place, and it's particularly irritating. Now, I'm plagiarized every day. Most of you know who I'm talking about. There's a group of people who made a living on this. But more broadly speaking, mainstream writers watch and listen and read guys like me every day. And the reason they do it is because at that level, they're working with oligarchs all the time. They work for them. They start thinking like them. Just like oligarchs steal money that they don't earn, these people steal ideas that they don't make. They'll read someone like, Roberts or me or Hoffman. They'll see how the idea, I'll do all the work, do all the spade work, do all the digging, all the statistics, all the translate, whatever you need. And they'll see how it plays out over time. Is it true? Are people catching on this? Then what they'll do is they'll take the idea, and then because they're far more powerful, will then present it like it's theirs. That they just discovered this. This is the case with 9/11 stuff, the war in Syria, even things like the Tsar Nicholas execution, the fake killing of Osama bin Laden, the ISIS charade, even the Ukrainian situation. Back when this was actually an issue, people like me were condemned and threatened. But they were watching very carefully. As I do all the work, people like me do all the work. Then some idiot from Fox News goes and steals it and claims it as their own. For some reason, I don't know, I don't get cited. Just an oversight, I guess. Well, that's the, academic version or the journalistic version of what billionaires do financially. But where did this money go? We're talking about oligarchy. We're talking about how oligarchy functions. Whether it be, I don't care if you're talking about Southeastern Europe or the riots in the cities. Oligarchy is based on, of course, the rule of money, the rule of standardization and quantity, but the control of information under the guise of free information. So what happens? Your typical Republican, constitutionalist idiot thinks that the only people who can, tyrannize over anybody are governments. And they refer to governments like a unitary thing. But that's not how power functions in the West. So what are the charities, so-called, that these guys, especially Gates and Buffett, bought all those years ago? Well, Gates donated $9 million to the British Guardian newspaper, $3 million to NBC, at least $4.5 million to NPR, $1 million to Al Jazeera, $49 million to BBC, and of course Jeff Bezos bought the Washington Post. Strange how this really wasn't a big issue, since the people who would make it an issue are these very people now. These are the charities that the press had reported worth billions of dollars from these people, and they're still being praised for their embrace of compassion and love for their fellow man. And I remember the puff pieces like it was yesterday. The irrational system, oligarchy is irrational. It's based not on production, it's based on the stealing of resources, asset stripping in essence. But the present crop of academics and journalists and the fake, news junkies, idiots, talking like they know something, they don't have the vocabulary to even describe what this is. This system has consequences. So, for example, the Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet. So you bail out companies, it means you buy up the distressed assets. This is really essentially what the bailout is. So now the Fed, which is the same, this is the banking elite, it's the same group of people, found itself now owning securities that makes them vulnerable. Ultimately what happens is these guys have sucked out the value of this capital. And through risky investments made them very vulnerable. And now now the taxpayer will take care of it, buy it out, and they don't have to worry about it. So that meant ultimately, and Paul Craig Robertson and Ron Paul and a few others came out and said, right, the lockdown was a week old and the Fed announced it would begin to purchase Treasury securities without any limit whatsoever. In other words, the elite stood to profit from American debt and American collapse, and they could shift the burden when everything goes south. The problem is journalists don't know how to describe this. They don't have they're used to the simply standardized language that they create themselves and that they use over and over again. That's not descriptive. It has nothing to do with reality. This is marketing. But this phenomenon is simply beyond them. Liberalism is so simplistic and naive. It can't describe any of this stuff. It has no idea. It's totally unsuited for a crisis like this. I want to close by saying, we've been all over the place today because I wanted to finish up the Montenegro stuff. But of course, given what's happened over the last 48 hours, all of a sudden all this chaos has forced me to change everything up. I'll end by saying simply how the press is tightly controlled. The word depression, referring to economics, was unofficially banned. You simply couldn't use it. Unless you were talking about 1929, you couldn't use it. They would say stupid things like the Great Recession of 2008, something stupid like that, because you couldn't use the word. The word was frightening to people, and if they saw America's in a depression, they'd pull their money out of banks. This is what the press does. They don't really know, but they know what power is and what to do. I was one of the few people to talk about that the U.S. was in a depression since 2008. I had papers going all the way back saying this. There was no recovery. Now, as I said before, mainstream writers are going through all this stuff and now making the exact same arguments over the last couple months. Suddenly they've discovered that the American economy had been in the brink of total disaster years before the virus came around, so they could blame it all on it. And as I mentioned elsewhere, the Fitch ratings agency, highly politicized. They say world GDP is going to fall 4% in 2020 globally. Unprecedented. What happened in 2008, 2009 is going to be twice as severe. So a decline in GDP essentially comes down to almost 3 trillion in global income levels relative to last year. Or almost 5 trillion relative to the pre-virus expectations of what was supposed to happen. Now, this is the Fitch agency talking. This is a group that's meant to analyze and judge the creditworthiness of securities. So when they say something like this, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. I said this time last year that the American press, especially last summer, all of a sudden went crazy talking about this record-breaking recovery and how healthy the economy was. The Guardian ran the headline, "Unusual U.S. economic recovery. Now it's longest in history," June 12th. The Financial Times, "The record-breaking U.S. economy recovery in charts," on July 4th, 2019. And the CNBC, this airhead, Elizabeth Schultz, "For the first time in history, the U.S. economy has started and ended a decade without a recession." This is just a handful. This is what they were saying a year ago. Now, these very same people now are saying that this contrived crisis shows how shallow and brittle and unstable the economic foundations of the system were. These are the same people that were reporting how wonderful everything was really just a few months ago. The CNBC thing was in December. They were saying right up until February that the economy has never been better. But the system is based on debt. What I've been trying to say, whether it be Serbia, Montenegro, Ukraine, Russia, even China, whatever I talk about, modernity means monetization, which means rule by debt. What's happened, especially over the last few years, is so-called economic recovery. And these guys knew this at the time. It's just ridiculously low interest rates, a massive rise in debt, both public and private, and a massive increase, of course, in oligarchy or social inequality. Now, the guys who were saying this time last year the economy is doing well, they weren't ignorant of this. They were aware of it. So now, all of a sudden, they're talking about how they always knew that the economy was brittle and in a lot of trouble and it was on the verge. All economists functioning knew that the economy was nearing collapse in 2010. I was the only one who was saying it, me and a few others. Paul Craig Roberts. A handful of others. But the only thing that regime learned from 2008 was that you can bail out the system without consequences. You can force people whose homes you just foreclosed on to pay you, to rescue you from your own irrationality. That's what they've learned. Trillions are being printed at the stroke of a pen, but since there's no production, you're going to have massive inflation. There's simply no other way around it. There is no middle class. Middle class is based entirely on debt. Given the fact that they're massively indebted, you can't say they own anything, because they owe more than they allegedly own. And what they own, they owe by debt anyway. So now you have the very wealthy and you have everyone else. I predicted, as I said before, I predicted in April that the regime is going to create a racial incident so that they then can get everyone talking about something other than economics. The use of public funds, the total takeover of the economy, the destruction of small businesses is deliberate, and the Fed is helping them do it. We've been through this at length, and this has really been the whole point of everything. Everything I've been talking about since I was a teenager. This is what modernity is. This is not an anomaly. This is not strange. This is not a mistake. This is inherent to the nature of the system. Just like modernity leads to post-modernity, capitalism leads to oligarchy, leads to almost acidic rule of an oligarch oligarchy usually is secret. Now it's out in the open.